Take a moment to get comfortable. There's no rush here. Whatever time it is where you are, whatever kind of day brought you to this, a long one, an ordinary one, a hard one, a fine one, you've made it to the quiet part now, and that's the only thing that needs doing tonight. If the lights are still on, you can leave them or turn them down. If the blanket isn't pulled up yet, pull it up. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. Let the day go where days go. You won't need to remember any of this. Nothing on the other side of these hours depends on you holding onto a single word. If you drift off in the middle of a sentence, the story keeps going without you, and it'll still be here when you come back to it. That's the whole arrangement. No test, no quiz, no part you have to catch up on. Just a long, slow walk through a strange and quiet corners of the last 70 years. The story of how people taught small pieces of code to copy themselves, and what happened next. That's what tonight's story is about. Computer viruses. The word probably sounds heavier than the story deserves. We tend to associate it with fear, with break-ins, with damage. Some of the story is like that. Most of it isn't. Most of it is about young people in small rooms, sitting in front of beige machines in the years before any of this seemed serious, writing little programs that could make copies of themselves. Some of them did it as a joke. Some of them did it as a science experiment. A few did it for money, and one or two did it for reasons no one outside their own room ever fully understood. One small thing before we begin, and then I'll stop talking about anything except the story. If you'd like a voice like this in the dark on other nights, other long, quiet things to drift to, tap subscribe now before you forget. It only takes a moment. Then we can settle in for real, and I won't ask you for anything else tonight. Now, let's begin where the story actually begins, which isn't where most people think. It begins before there were computers to put viruses on. It begins with a man, a piece of chalk, and a question. Chapter 1. Before there were viruses, there was an idea in the late 1940s in a place called Princeton, New Jersey. A man named John von Neumann was thinking about something almost no one else was thinking about. He had finished helping build one of the first electronic computers, a machine that filled a room and weighed as much as a small truck, and he had begun to ask a strange question. He was wondering whether a machine could build a copy of itself. This wasn't a practical question. There wasn't a market for it. Nobody had asked him to figure it out. But von Neumann was the kind of mind that wandered into questions other people would have considered useless, and then turned them into mathematics that everyone would eventually need. He was Hungarian by birth, in his middle 40s by then, sharp-featured and impatient and famously kind to children. And his name would later be attached to the basic architecture of nearly every computer ever built. In the late 40s, though, he was just thinking about reproduction. The question was simple, on the surface. Living things make copies of themselves. A bacterium splits in two. A plant drops a seed. A person, given enough time, can put another person into the world. None of this seems mysterious until you sit down with a piece of paper and try to describe in precise mathematical language how a thing could possibly contain the instructions for making another version of itself without becoming impossibly large. Because the instructions would have to include instructions for making the instructions, and those instructions would need to include their own instructions, and so on, forever. Von Neumann worked on this problem on and off for years. He gave a series of lectures about it in Illinois in 1949. He sketched out, in pure abstraction, what he called a self-reproducing automaton, a kind of imaginary machine that could read a blueprint of itself, build a copy, and then hand the blueprint to its child, so the child could do the same thing. He never finished the paper. He died of cancer in 1957, at the age of 53 in a hospital in Washington, D.C., where he had spent his final months under armed guard because the United States government was worried that, in his deteriorating mental state, he might accidentally let slip some of the nation's nuclear secrets to a passing nurse. His mind, by then, was almost the only thing left of him. He had been one of the most extraordinary thinkers of his century. He had helped build the atomic bomb. He had invented game theory. He had laid the foundations of the computer. He died, in pain, half coherent, with two soldiers in the hallway making sure his thoughts did not escape the room. The work on self-reproducing machines was published a decade after his death by a colleague named Arthur Burks, who pulled it together from the lectures and the notes that von Neumann had left behind. What von Neumann had done, without quite realizing it, was lay the theoretical foundation for everything that would eventually be called a computer virus. He had shown that self-reproduction wasn't just something biology did. It was something information could do, in the right kind of environment, given the right kind of rules. For a long time, this stayed in the realm of pure theory. The computers of the 1950s were too primitive, too expensive, too carefully guarded to be the kind of playground where you could test out ideas about self-replication. Each one was a serious piece of equipment, watched over by serious people, used for serious purposes. There was no spare room to play in. That started to change in the early 1960s when something called time-sharing came along. Time-sharing was the idea that several people could use the same computer at the same time, with the machine flipping between their tasks so quickly that each user felt as if they had the whole thing to themselves. It made computers cheaper to access, and it brought a younger generation into the room. Graduate students, hobbyists, people who weren't being paid to be there but were just curious. At Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey, 3 programmers named Robert Morris Sr., Victor Vysotsky, and Doug McElroy invented a game for themselves. It was called Darwin, and it ran inside the memory of one of the lab's mainframe computers in the early 60s. The rules were simple. Each player wrote a small program. The programs were placed into the same area of memory and turned loose. Each one was trying to find the other programs and destroy them, while also making copies of itself to spread its presence around. The last program still running won. Darwin evolved, over the years, into something called Core War. The game itself was formally described in a 1984 article in Scientific American by a Canadian computer scientist named A.K. Dewdney, who had taken the underground tradition from places like Bell Labs and given it rules that anyone could follow. There was a simulated computer, called the Memory Array Red Code Simulator, and a small invented programming language called Red Code, and you could write a Red Code program of any reasonable length and submit it to a tournament. Tournaments were held by hobbyist magazines and computer clubs and, eventually, by universities. A few classic programs became famous within the small community of people who played. There was a program called IMP that did nothing but slowly walk forward through memory, overwriting everything in its path with copies of itself. There was a program called Dwarf that sat in one place and dropped destructive instructions into random memory locations. There were programs that did both. There were programs that could detect what kind of program was attacking them and respond with a counterattack. By the mid-'80s, Core War had become a kind of underground sport among programmers, a hobby, an art form, a way of showing off. People wrote tiny programs with names like Imp and Dwarf and Mice, designed for nothing but to survive in a small, hostile, simulated computer where everything was trying to copy itself and eat everything else. It was, in a way, the first time anyone had built a place where the idea of self-reproducing code could actually exist. You could see it happen. You could watch a program clone itself 10 times, then 100, then 1,000, all in the space of a few seconds until it had filled the simulated world. The fact that it was all happening inside an enclosed sandbox, a small piece of memory that couldn't reach outside, meant nobody worried much about it. It was just a game. But somewhere in those years, in a way that's hard to pin down to a single moment, an idea moved from one place to another. The idea was this. If a small program could copy itself inside a controlled environment, it could probably copy itself outside one too. The boundary that made Core War safe, the wall around the simulated world, wasn't actually a fundamental thing. It was just a choice. And if someone made a different choice, something else could happen. Nobody in those early years was particularly worried about that possibility. The computers were still mostly isolated. There was no internet to speak of. There was barely any way to move a program from one machine to another, except by carrying a piece of magnetic tape across the room. Even if someone had written a self-reproducing program that could escape its sandbox, there wouldn't have been many places for it to go. That was about to change. Toward the end of the 1960s, a small network of research computers had started to come together. It had 4 nodes when it began, then a few more, then dozens. It was called the ARPANET, and it was the ancestor of what we now call the Internet. For the first time in history, a computer could send a message to another computer in another city without anyone having to physically carry it there. And for the first time, a small program, if such a thing existed, if anyone bothered to write one, could go for a walk. Chapter 2. The First One in the Wild. The story of the first real virus, the first piece of self-copying code that anyone seriously meant to be one, begins in a low brick building in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in or around the year 1971. The building belonged to a company called Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, which everyone just called BBN. It was a small consulting firm with a few hundred engineers, and it had been hired by the United States Department of Defense to build the early pieces of the ARPANET. The work was technical and patient, and mostly invisible to the outside world. The Internet, as a thing the public would ever care about, was still more than a decade away. Inside BBN, a programmer named Bob Thomas was working on a piece of operating system software called 10X. 10X was what ran on the mainframe computers that BBN connected to the ARPANET. It was a complicated piece of software, and people who worked on it had a deep daily familiarity with how it moved tasks around in memory and across the network. One day, Thomas wrote a small program. The program had one job. It would land on a computer, announce itself, and then jump, copy itself, onto the next computer it could find on the network. When it arrived on the new machine, it would print a message on whatever terminal happened to be nearby. The message was this: "I'm the Creeper. Catch me if you can." That was it. There was no payload. The program didn't steal anything, didn't damage anything, didn't try to hide. It just hopped from machine to machine, announcing its presence to anyone who happened to be looking at a screen when it arrived. Thomas hadn't meant it as a virus in the modern sense, because the word wouldn't even be used for that kind of thing for another decade. He had meant it as a demonstration. He wanted to show that a program could move itself across the network without a human carrying it. He had built a mobile thing. There's a small disagreement among historians about exactly how many machines Creeper reached. Some say only a few. Some say a dozen. The network in 1971 was tiny, just a handful of nodes scattered across research universities and government labs. But the program worked. It hopped. It left its little message on the terminals of researchers who had no idea it was coming. And then a colleague of Thomas's, a man named Ray Tomlinson, decided to write a response. Ray Tomlinson is a name worth pausing on for a moment, because he's one of those people who quietly invented something everyone now uses without remembering that anyone invented it at all. The year before he wrote his response to Creeper, Tomlinson had been the person who decided, more or less on his own, that email messages should be addressed using the symbol from above the 2 on the typewriter, the small curl that nobody had any other use for, the @ sign. The address format he chose, with someone's name on the left and the name of their computer on the right, joined by that little curl, is still the format we use today. Every email address you've ever sent or received exists in the shape Tomlinson chose during a quiet week at BBN in 1901. The same Tomlinson, in or around the same year, decided that Creeper needed company. He wrote a second program. This one had the same ability to move from machine to machine across the ARPANET, but it had a different job. It was looking for Creeper. When it found a copy, it would erase it. It moved through the network, leaving cleaned-up machines in its wake. Tomlinson called this second program Reaper. The whole story has a quietness to it that's easy to miss. 2 programmers, working in the same building, on the same network, decided to invent both the first self-replicating program and the first program that hunted other self-replicating programs. There was no panic, no security industry, no consequences. It was just 2 friends, in a place where nobody much was watching, building a little game out of the network they had helped build. Reaper, as far as anyone knows, was the first piece of software ever written specifically to remove other software. It was, in a sense, the first antivirus program, although the word antivirus, like virus, wouldn't come along for years. It existed before there was anything for it to fight other than the thing its inventor's friend had just made. A few years later, in 1904, someone wrote a similar but more troublesome program called Rabbit. The name was descriptive. Rabbit didn't move from machine to machine. It just sat on the computer it was on and made copies of itself over and over, faster and faster, until there were so many rabbits in memory that the machine slowed down, choked, and stopped. There was no message, no announcement, just a quiet, exponential multiplication that filled the machine and brought it to a halt. The Rabbit program was the first time anyone had seen what would later become a recurring shape of computer trouble. A program designed not to damage data, but simply to multiply itself so aggressively that the system couldn't keep up. The pattern would come back again and again over the next 50 years in larger and stranger forms. In 1974, though, it was a single rabbit in a single research lab, and it was solved by turning the computer off and on again. The word virus for any of this still hadn't been used. It was waiting in the wings, in the head of a graduate student named Fred Cohen, who would borrow it from biology in the early 80s and give it to computer science. He would define a computer virus in his doctoral work as a program that could infect other programs by modifying them to include a copy of itself. That definition would stick. It's still, more or less, what we mean by the word today. And once the word arrived, the things it described started to seem more recognizable as a category, as a thing, rather than as a collection of one-off experiments by friends in research labs. But the recognizable category, the thing the world would eventually come to fear, started in a much smaller and quieter way than the word suggests. It started with a friendly little message that announced itself and ran away. It started with a hunter built by a friend of the inventor. It started, the way nearly everything in this story starts, with someone in a room, alone, writing something small to see what it would do. Chapter 3. A Teenager in Pittsburgh. The first computer virus that nobody made on purpose to be a research experiment, the first one that escaped, in a real and uncontained way, into the world, was written by a 15-year-old boy in his bedroom in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the winter of 1981 and 1982. His name was Rich Skrenta. He was a ninth grader at Mount Lebanon High School. He liked computers in the way that 15-year-olds in 1981 sometimes liked computers, which is to say, very intensely, with the kind of focus that only comes when there are still very few other people in your school who care about the same thing. He owned an Apple II, the famously friendly home computer that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had introduced in 1977. The Apple II was beige and a little too heavy and had a green screen, and it ran programs by reading them off of floppy disks that you slid into a slot in the front of a drive that sat next to the machine. Skrenta had a habit that had begun to make him slightly unpopular with his friends. He liked to alter the floppy disks he gave them. If a friend asked to borrow a game, Skrenta would copy the game onto a fresh floppy and modify it just a little, adding a small program that would print a teasing message, or change the title screen, or play a noise at an unexpected moment. The first time it was funny. By the third or fourth time, his friends had started to refuse any floppy disk that came from Rich. This was a real problem. Floppy disks, in 1981, were how computer software moved. There was no internet to download things from. If you wanted to share a program, you carried a physical disk to a friend. If your friends stopped accepting your disks, you were effectively cut off from the part of computing that was about sharing things. So Skrenta started thinking about how he might get his pranks onto his friends' machines, without them needing to accept a disk from him at all. What he came up with, over the course of several weeks of tinkering, was a small piece of code that he attached to the Apple II's operating system. The trick of it was this. When you ran an Apple II program from a floppy disk, The operating system loaded itself into memory from the disk first. Skrenta wrote a version of the operating system that, in addition to doing its normal job, would also quietly copy itself onto any other floppy disk you put into the drive afterward. Then, when that disk was carried over to another machine and used to boot up someone else's Apple II, Skrenta's modified operating system would load on that machine too, and it would do the same thing again. Every disk that machine touched would now carry a copy. He called the program Elk Cloner. He wrote it as a poem. After 50 boots of an infected machine, Elk Cloner would announce itself. The screen would clear, and the poem would appear in plain green letters on the black screen of an Apple II. It said something like this: "It will get on all your disks. It will infiltrate your chips. Yes, it's Cloner. It will stick to you like glue. It will modify RAM too. Send in the Cloner." That was the entire payload. There was no damage. There was no information stolen. There was a poem. Skrenta let the program loose by giving an infected disk to a friend, the way he had given infected disks to friends 100 times before. But this time the prank wasn't on his friend. The prank was on his friend's disks, and on the disks of everyone his friend would lend a disk to, and on the disks of everyone they would lend a disk to. The program slipped through Skrenta's circle of friends, then through their friends, then beyond. Elk Cloner traveled in a way that's hard to imagine in the age of the Internet, because it traveled at the speed of human beings physically carrying things to each other. A disk would change hands at a school. A disk would be loaned to a cousin who lived in another town. A disk would be brought by a kid on a family vacation to a relative's house in another state and used on the relative's machine, leaving a small green poem waiting for the 50th boot. Years later, in interviews, people would tell Skrenta that they had encountered Elk Cloner on Apple machines in places he had never been. In California, in Texas, even in Europe. One person told him that someone in the United States Navy had encountered the poem on a Navy computer. This is worth pausing on, because the slow, physical, person-to-person nature of how Elk Cloner spread is something that no virus would ever quite have again. Every later virus, every one we'll talk about tonight, will have moved at the speed of a network, by wires and signals and packets, in the kind of way that can reach the other side of the world in a few seconds. Elk Cloner moved at the speed of teenagers handing each other disks. It took years to reach the places it reached. It was the last virus that traveled like a piece of paper. Skrenta himself, after writing it, mostly moved on. He finished high school. He went to college. He worked for a defense contractor for a while, and then he moved to Silicon Valley, the way a lot of curious computer kids did in the 80s and 90s, and he founded a company that built a kind of early news aggregator called Topix. He worked at Netscape. He helped build a search engine called Bleco that was eventually bought by IBM. He never built another virus. He never seemed especially proud of having built that one. When journalists came to interview him about Elk Cloner, in the years when the world started writing the history of viruses, he was friendly and a little sheepish, the way someone is when you ask them about something they did as a kid. What's strange about Elk Cloner, looking back on it, is how completely it set the pattern that everything else would follow. A young person sitting in front of a personal computer with no particular plan and no particular malice, writing a small thing to see if it would work, and discovering, to their surprise, sometimes to their alarm, that it worked very well, and that the world it had escaped into was much bigger than the room it had been written in. That shape, the kid in the room, the prank that grew larger than expected, the slow realization in the years after that something had been crossed, would happen again, and again, and again, through the 80s and the 90s, and into the new century. The room would change. The computer would change. The country would change. But the shape would stay almost the same. The next room, as it happens, was on the other side of the world. Chapter 4. Two Brothers in Lahore. In the city of Lahore, in Pakistan, two brothers ran a small medical software shop on Neela Gumbad Road. The older brother was named Amjad Farooq Alvi. He was in his early 20s, soft-spoken, careful with money, and possessed of the kind of patience that's almost a personality trait. The younger brother was Basit Farooq Alvi. He was 17, more impulsive, with a head full of ideas that came faster than he could test them. Together, in the early 1980s, they had founded a company called Brain Computer Services, which they named after the part of a person that the brothers admired most. Brain Computer Services wrote medical software. The brothers would sit at their machines and write small programs that helped doctors keep track of patients, schedule appointments, and manage prescriptions. They sold these programs on floppy disks to medical clinics in Lahore and in the surrounding cities. The work was unglamorous and only mildly profitable, but it was theirs, and they ran it with a kind of pride. By 1986, they had noticed a problem. Their software was being copied. Doctors who bought one copy of a program were duplicating the floppy disk and giving it to other doctors. The other doctors were duplicating it and giving it to still more. Versions of the brothers' software, bearing their company's name, had begun appearing in cities the brothers had never visited, on machines they had never sold to. There was, at that time, no real law against software piracy in Pakistan, and even if there had been, there was no practical way to enforce it. The brothers' main feeling about all of this seems to have been a kind of bewildered curiosity. They wanted to understand how far their software had traveled. So they wrote a program, a small one, attached to the boot sector of the floppy disks they sold, that would do two things. The first was that it would quietly modify any other floppy disk inserted into the same machine, copying itself onto that disk so that the program would spread along with the brothers' medical software. The second was that, when it ran, it would show a small message on the screen. The message read, in slightly broken English, something like the following: "Welcome to the dungeon. Beware of this virus. Contact us for vaccination." Then, very clearly, it gave the names of both brothers, the name of their company, the address of the shop on Neela Gumbad Road, and 3 telephone numbers. This is the part of the story that almost nobody who hears it the first time can quite believe. The Farouk Alvi brothers, in writing what would turn out to be the first computer virus ever to infect IBM-compatible personal computers, included their own names, the name of their business, the address of their shop, and a working phone number. They did this by their own later account because they were genuinely curious. They wanted to know who was running their software and where. And they thought that if their program ended up on a machine in a faraway place, the person who saw the message might be inclined to call. People called. Within months of Brain's release in early 1986, the brothers were getting telephone calls from people in places they had never heard of asking why their floppy disks now contained a strange message about a dungeon and the brothers' phone number. The calls came from England, from the United States, from Israel, from Singapore. The brothers, who had written the program imagining at most that it might reach Karachi or Islamabad, found themselves on long-distance calls with confused American university students who had no idea who they were, or how a piece of code from a medical software company in Lahore had ended up on their personal computer in Iowa. What had happened, in retrospect, was straightforward, but had not been obvious to the brothers ahead of time. Software piracy didn't only happen within Pakistan. The brothers' medical software, having been copied across Pakistan, was being carried by people who traveled, by students going abroad to study, by business people flying to other countries, by relatives sending floppy disks in the mail. Brain traveled the way Elk Cloner had traveled, at the speed of human beings carrying disks. But it traveled across oceans because the people carrying it did. The Farouk Alvi brothers were horrified by their later account at how far their experiment had gone. They had not meant to bother anyone. They had certainly not meant to be at the center of an international incident. They patiently explained to every caller they could understand what their program did and how to remove it. They offered, in a few cases, to mail people clean copies of replacement disks. They were sometimes blamed in the early newspaper stories that started appearing about computer viruses, as if they were criminals. The brothers, by all accounts, did not feel like criminals. They felt like two people who had asked a question and gotten a much larger answer than they expected. The brain virus was not, by the standards of what would come later, a serious thing. It didn't destroy any files. It didn't steal any data. It used up a small amount of memory on the machines it landed on, and showed an occasional polite message identifying itself. By 1987 and 1988, computer security people were already talking about it as a kind of historical curiosity. The first PC virus, but not a particularly mean one. What Brain represented, looking back, was something larger than the program itself. It was the moment when the idea of a computer virus crossed over from being a research experiment, or a friend-to-friend prank, into something that could appear on a machine anywhere in the world and have come from somewhere you had never been. It was the first time that owning a personal computer meant being potentially connected to the projects of strangers in other countries. Until Brain, the things on your floppy disks had come from you, or from people you had given disks to. After Brain, that was no longer always true. The brothers, decades later, are still in Lahore. Their company, which is still called Brain, is no longer in the medical software business. It is one of the largest internet service providers in Pakistan. They have given many interviews over the years, always patient, always slightly sheepish, always emphasizing that what they did was an act of curiosity rather than aggression. When asked whether they regret writing the program, they generally say no, and then they add a few sentences about how the world has changed since then in ways that surprised them. What they sometimes say, near the end of those interviews, is that they think computer viruses began as a question that nobody quite knew how to ask. The question was something like, what is the boundary between my computer and your computer? In 1986, with no internet, with software moving on physical disks between machines, that boundary had felt almost solid. After Brain, and after everything that followed it, the boundary was less and less of a thing. The brothers helped make that change visible, even though they were trying, mostly, just to find out who was reading their work. 2 years after Brain, the boundary would dissolve almost completely, on a Tuesday night in November, when a graduate student at Cornell University ran a program he had written and watched what should have stayed in his laboratory go everywhere. Chapter 5. The Night the Internet Stopped. The graduate student was named Robert Tappan Morris. He was 23 years old in the fall of 1988. He had grown up in a quiet New Jersey town, the son of a computer scientist named Robert Morris Sr., who had spent his career at Bell Labs working on Unix, and who would shortly take a position as the chief scientist at the National Security Agency. The younger Morris had grown up around computers the way other kids grow up around a family business. They were on the dinner table, in conversations after school, present in his life from his earliest memories. He was, by the fall of 1988, a graduate student in computer science at Cornell University in upstate New York. He was a soft-spoken, slightly awkward young man. He didn't talk much. He spent most of his time in front of a screen. What he was working on in the weeks leading up to November 1988 was a small program, a self-replicating one, that was designed to do something he found scientifically interesting. He wanted to measure the size of the Internet. This sounds strange now. In 1988, the Internet was small enough that you could imagine measuring it, in the sense of counting the number of computers connected to it. There were estimates. Nobody knew the exact number. Most estimates put it at around 60,000 machines worldwide. The Internet, in 1988, was used mostly by universities, military research labs, and a few large corporations. There was no World Wide Web yet. There was no Google. There was barely any commercial use of the network at all. It was a research tool, and the people who used it mostly knew each other or knew of each other by name. Morris had the idea that he could write a small program that would land on a computer, count itself as one machine, and then carefully try to move itself to other machines on the network. As it spread, you could, in theory, count how many machines it had reached, and that would give you a real measurement of how large the Internet actually was. It was the kind of project that would have made a good chapter in a doctoral thesis. He had a particular interest, as he wrote it, in not being detected. He didn't want every computer to know it was being measured, because then the count would be off. So he included some clever tricks. The program would, when it arrived on a new machine, check to see whether the machine was already running a copy of itself. If it was, the new copy would, most of the time, quietly delete itself, because there was no point in having two copies of a measuring program on the same computer. But Morris worried, in the days before he released the program, that other people might catch on to what he was doing and try to inoculate their machines against him by running fake copies of his program that would tell the real copy to leave. So he added what he thought was a small safeguard. One time out of 7, when his program arrived on a machine that already had a copy of itself, it would copy itself anyway. That way, if anyone tried to fool his program, they wouldn't entirely succeed. The number 1 out of 7 would turn out to be the most expensive guess Morris ever made. On the evening of November 2nd, 1988, around 6 in the evening Eastern Time, Morris connected to a computer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a school where he wasn't a student, but where he had access to a machine, and from there he released his program onto the Internet. He chose to release it from MIT rather than from Cornell because he wanted to make it harder to trace the origin back to him. The program spread, the way he had designed it to. It moved from machine to machine, looking for accounts to log into, exploiting a handful of known weaknesses in the software that ran the early Internet. The 1 in 7 decision started to go wrong very quickly. On heavily connected machines, the ones with the most network neighbors, Morris's program kept finding itself, kept rolling its 1 in 7 dice, and kept copying itself anyway. Within an hour, some machines on the network had 10, 20, 50 copies of the program running at once, all of them trying to spread further. The copies competed with each other for the machine's resources. The machines slowed down. Then they stopped responding. Then they crashed. By around 10 that night, system administrators at universities up and down the East Coast had noticed that something was deeply wrong. Computers that had been working that afternoon were now unreachable. The ones that could still be reached were behaving strangely, refusing to accept new connections, running at full capacity for reasons no one could identify. As word spread through the small community of people who ran the early internet, the picture got worse. It was happening everywhere. At Harvard, at Berkeley, at Stanford, at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, at the Rand Corporation. Across the country, machines were quietly going dark. By the early hours of November 3rd, a group of programmers at Berkeley and at Purdue and at a few other universities had started to take apart copies of the program and figure out what it was doing. They began writing instructions for how to remove it. The instructions had to be distributed by telephone, because much of the network the instructions would normally have moved across was no longer working. People stayed up all night, on the phone with people in other time zones, reading hexadecimal code to each other and trying to disinfect the machines they were responsible for. It took several days for the network to fully recover. The final estimate was that around 6,000 machines had been affected, close to 10% of the entire Internet, in the form it then took. Morris, when he understood what was happening, became deeply distressed. He called a friend at Harvard from a payphone, not wanting to use his own line, and asked the friend to send an anonymous message to the system administrators explaining how to stop the program. By the time the message was sent, the worm had already spread too far for the message to matter. Morris went to his parents' house. He told his father what had happened. His father, the National Security Agency scientist, helped him get a lawyer. The trial, when it came, was the first time anyone had been prosecuted under a 1986 law called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The prosecutors argued that Morris had knowingly accessed computers without permission and caused damage. Morris's lawyers argued that the damage had been accidental, the result of a flaw in his program that he had never intended. The jury sided with the prosecution. Morris was sentenced to 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of just over $10,000. He did not go to prison. He finished his graduate work and became a professor of computer science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he still teaches today. He has given a small number of interviews over the years. He doesn't say much about the worm. When he does, what he tends to say is that he was young, that he was curious, and that he made a mistake. What the Morris worm did to the world was twofold. It was the first time the general public, through newspaper stories that ran for days, heard the word Internet. Most Americans, in November of 1988, didn't know there was such a thing. They learned about it because of a story about a graduate student who had broken it. And it was the first time that the people who built the network understood, in a deep and now permanent way, that the network they had built was not safe. It was full of weaknesses. Some of those weaknesses were ones they had known about and not bothered to fix. Some of them they had never imagined. The night of November 2nd, 1988, was the night that the question of computer security stopped being a quiet hobbyist concern and started becoming, slowly and then quickly, an industry. The next decade would see the question grow larger than anyone in 1988 could have predicted. By the time it crested, on a Thursday in May of the year 2000, the trouble would no longer come from a graduate student at Cornell. It would come from a young man, much like Morris in some ways, very different in others, working alone in a small apartment in Manila. Chapter 6. Spring in Manila. Before we get to the apartment in Manila, there's a smaller story that has to come first, because it set the stage for what happened there. The story belongs to a man named David Smith, who lived in Aberdeen Township, New Jersey, and who was in his early 30s in the spring of '99. Smith worked as a network programmer. He had a particular interest in a type of computer document called a macro, which was a small program that could be embedded inside a Microsoft Word file and would run quietly when the file was opened. Macros had been designed to let people automate small tasks inside their documents. Smith had a different idea for what they could do. In late March of '99, he uploaded a Word document to an online discussion group that specialized in adult content. The document was advertised as a list of passwords for various pornography websites. The macro inside the document, when the file was opened, would do two things. It would lower the security settings of Microsoft Word on the computer, so that future Word documents could carry macros without anyone being warned. And it would open Microsoft Outlook, find the first 50 entries in the user's address book, and send each of those people an email with the same Word document attached. Smith had named the document after a stripper he had known in Florida. Her name was Melissa. The virus, as it came to be called, spread faster than any virus before it. Within hours, it was inside corporate email systems all over North America. Within a day or two, it had reached Europe and Asia. Microsoft's own email servers were briefly overwhelmed. Intel had to shut down its email system. The U.S. Marine Corps had to shut down some of its networks. By the end of the first week, an estimated 1 million computers had been infected. The payload of Melissa was almost nothing. Once a day, if the date and time matched a particular pattern, It would insert a small quotation from the Simpsons television show into whatever document the user happened to be editing. That was all. The damage was entirely in the spreading in the bandwidth that 50 emails from every infected machine consumed, in the workdays lost to email systems being shut down for cleanup. David Smith was arrested within a week. He was traced through the unique identification number that Microsoft Word in those days embedded in every document. He pleaded guilty. He cooperated with the prosecutors against other virus writers, and in exchange, his sentence was reduced. He served 20 months in federal prison and paid a $5,000 fine. Melissa, when you look at it from the right angle, was a kind of dress rehearsal for what was about to come from a different continent. It had demonstrated very clearly that email could carry viruses to millions of people in a single day. It had demonstrated that people would, almost without thinking, open attachments from senders they knew. It had demonstrated that the address books inside email programs were essentially loaded weapons, pointed at everyone the user had ever exchanged messages with. A year and a half after Melissa, in an apartment in Manila, someone else figured out how to take what David Smith had built and make it bigger. The young man in Manila was named Onel de Guzman. He was 24 years old in the spring of 2000. He lived with his sister and her husband in a small apartment in a working-class neighborhood of the Philippine capital, and he was, by most measures, not having a very good year. He had been a computer science student at AMA Computer College, which was a large, for-profit school in Manila with branches all over the country. He had recently dropped out. He had dropped out more or less, because the school had rejected his proposed thesis. His thesis had been about a way of stealing internet passwords from other people's computers so that poor people could use the internet without paying for it. The school had not liked this idea. They had told him to write a different thesis. He had refused. This is sometimes told as if it were just a quirky detail, but it's worth pausing on. The internet, in the Philippines in 2000, was prohibitively expensive for most people. To get online, you paid by the minute, and the rates were high. De Guzman, as he later explained in a small number of interviews, was a poor young man in a poor neighborhood who wanted to use the internet but could not afford to. His thesis proposal, to write a program that would steal Windows passwords stored on people's computers and send them back to him, was, in his own mind, a kind of populist project. He wanted to make the internet free by, essentially, helping people log in to other people's accounts. He did not seem to consider that the people whose accounts would be stolen might object. The thesis was rejected. De Guzman dropped out of school. But he had already written most of the code that the thesis would have required. He had a working program that could, when it ran on a Windows computer, find passwords saved on the machine and email them to a particular address. What he didn't have was a way of getting his program onto enough machines for it to matter. In late April of 2000, he started experimenting. He modified his program to include a small payload, a self-copying mechanism that would email itself to everyone in the address book of any infected computer. He thought of it as a way of testing his thesis's underlying premise, that a program could spread through email and harvest passwords as it went. He didn't think it would spread far. He thought, by his later account, that maybe it would reach a few thousand people. He thought about the subject line of the email a great deal. He needed something that would make people want to open the attachment. Something irresistible. He landed, after some thought, on 3 words: I love you. On the evening of May 4th, 2000, by the calendar in Manila, de Guzman sent the email from his apartment. The subject line was the 3 words. The body of the email said, "Kindly check the attached love letter coming from me." The attachment was a file that looked, to most people glancing at it, like a text file, but was in fact a small program. People who got the email did what de Guzman had bet they would do. They opened it. Almost everyone, when they receive an email with the subject line, "I love you," opens it. Even if they're suspicious. Even if they don't recognize the sender. The pull of the words is too strong. So they opened the attachment, and the attachment ran, and the program inside it began to do its work. It found the email program on the computer. It opened the user's address book. It composed a new email to every person in the address book. The subject line was the same 3 words. The body was the same kindly check sentence. The attachment was a copy of itself. It sent every one of those emails. Then, having done that, it began looking through the computer's files for any images and documents it could find. And it overwrote them with copies of itself, so that the next time the user tried to open a vacation photo or a tax return, they would instead unknowingly run another copy of the program. By the morning of May 5th, the program had spread out of Manila into the Asian banking centers, Hong Kong and Tokyo and Singapore, that opened for business hours before Europe did. By midday, it had moved through Europe. By the time the United States woke up, it was everywhere. Government computers at the Pentagon were affected. The British Parliament had to shut down its email system. The Belgian Central Bank lost service. CNN was infected. So were Microsoft and Ford and Goldman Sachs. So were millions of home computers belonging to people who had received an email from a friend in 3 words that they could not resist opening. The estimates of the damage vary, depending on what you count. Most analyses put the total cost across the world at around $10 billion. About 45 million computers were infected in the first 10 days. I Love You was, by some measures, the fastest spreading computer virus in history up to that point. It went around the planet in roughly the time it took most people to read about it in the newspaper. The Philippine National Bureau of Investigation traced the program back to de Guzman's apartment within about 2 days. He was questioned. He admitted, more or less, that he had written it. He said he hadn't meant for it to spread so far. He said he had been experimenting. He said he was sorry. And then, in a kind of legal anticlimax that nobody anticipated, the case against him fell apart. The Philippines, in May of 2000, had no laws against writing or distributing computer viruses. Lawmakers in Manila had simply not gotten around to it. The prosecutors tried to charge him under existing fraud laws, but a court ruled that those laws didn't apply. The charges were dropped. De Guzman walked out of police custody in front of a small crowd of reporters, free. The Philippines passed an anti-cybercrime law about a month later. It did not apply to de Guzman because the law cannot retroactively make something a crime that wasn't a crime when it was done. So he became, in a sense, the last person who would ever release a major virus and face no legal consequence at all. After 1000, the world had laws ready for the next one. De Guzman didn't have a public career after I Love You. He gave a few interviews over the years, always brief, always reluctant. In 2020, on the 20th anniversary of the virus, a journalist tracked him down. He was running a small phone repair shop in Manila, the kind of shop where, for a few dollars, you can have a cracked screen replaced or a battery swapped out. He had no internet at home. He said he had stopped using a computer for personal things many years before. He said he hadn't meant for the virus to spread the way it had. He said he was sorry. He said the same thing he had said in 2000, in the same quiet voice. The world had moved on. By the early 21st century, the era of single individuals writing viruses for the satisfaction of seeing them spread was already drawing to a close. The viruses that came next would still sometimes have a person behind them, but more and more they would be the work of groups. Sometimes large groups, sometimes loose collections of people who had never met. The viruses would also become technically stranger, faster, and far more efficient. The next chapter belongs to those viruses. They moved at speeds that I Love You could not have imagined, and they had names that became, for a few years, briefly famous, and then mostly forgotten. Chapter 7. Worms Across the Wires. The thing about a worm, technically, is that it doesn't need anyone to open it. A virus, in the older sense of the word, has to be invited in. Someone has to run the file. Someone has to open the email. Someone has to put the floppy disk into the drive. A worm doesn't need any of that. A worm finds its way in by itself, through some weakness in the software that was already running on the computer. Usually a flaw the manufacturer hadn't noticed, or had noticed and not fixed, or had fixed in a patch that the computer's owner hadn't yet installed. Once a worm got loose on a network of millions of similar machines with the same unpatched flaw, it didn't need a single human being to lift a finger. It would do all the spreading itself. That's why, for about 5 years at the start of the 21st century, worms ruled. They were the most spectacular things in the world of computer security, the way storms can be spectacular even when you'd rather they didn't exist. The first of those years was 2001. The summer of 2001 belonged to a worm called Code Red. It had been named after a kind of soft drink that the people who discovered it were drinking at the time, a strange and accidental piece of name-giving that ended up being the name everyone used. Code Red spread by finding computers running a particular kind of Microsoft web server software, a piece of software called IIS that had a known weakness. Microsoft had released a patch for the weakness a month before. Most administrators had not yet applied the patch. When the worm landed on a vulnerable server, it would do 2 things. It would, after a few days, instruct the machine to flood the White House website with the traffic, in the hopes of taking that website offline as a kind of political demonstration. And it would also, importantly, deface the websites the server was hosting, replacing the home page with a message that read, in plain text, "Hello, welcome to a particular address, hacked by Chinese." Whether Code Red was actually written by anyone in China was never proven. The message was probably a misdirection. But for a few weeks in July of 2001, hundreds of thousands of websites around the world were briefly replaced with that message, and the White House, behind the scenes, had to change its address to dodge the incoming flood. The worm faded. The websites came back. Most people who used the internet that summer never noticed. 18 months later, on a Saturday morning in January of 2003, a much faster and much stranger worm appeared. It was called SQL Slammer. SQL Slammer was the size of a single packet of data. It was 376 bytes long. To give a sense of scale, the average song on a phone is about 10 million bytes. The average photograph is several million. SQL Slammer was so small that it didn't even need to make a proper connection to spread. It just sent itself, in a single packet, to a random internet address. And if the address happened to be a Microsoft database server with a particular unpatched flaw, the server would receive the packet, run the worm inside it, and then immediately begin sending out new copies of the same packet to new random addresses. What happened next is one of the strangest things in the short history of the Internet. SQL Slammer doubled the number of machines it had infected every 8.5 seconds. Within 10 minutes, it had reached essentially every vulnerable machine on the planet. Banks went down. Bank of America's cash machine network went offline because the database servers that processed transactions could no longer handle the volume of worm traffic on the network. South Korea, which had a high concentration of vulnerable servers, lost most of its internet for the better part of a day. Continental Airlines had to cancel flights because its check-in system couldn't reach its reservations database. There was no payload. The worm did not damage data. It did not steal anything. It did not even leave a message. It just spread, as fast as the laws of physics would let a piece of data spread, until it had run out of new computers to spread to, and then it sat there using up bandwidth until system administrators around the world figured out how to filter out its specific packet, and the storm subsided. Nobody was ever charged with writing SQL Slammer. Its author has never come forward. The forensic trail went cold within days. The leading theory among computer security researchers is that it was written by a single person, working alone, who had no idea how fast the worm would spread. The math of doubling every 8 seconds is the kind of math that surprises everyone the first time they encounter it. It almost certainly surprised whoever pressed the button on a Saturday morning in January 2003. The third worm worth mentioning belongs to a teenager. His name was Sven Yashan, and he was 17 years old in 2004, living in the small town of Waffensen in northern Germany. He had a fondness for computers and a casual contempt for Microsoft, which he felt did a careless job of writing secure software. In late April of 2004, partly as a kind of birthday present to himself and partly because he wanted to test what he had been learning, he released a worm onto the internet that he called Sasser. Sasser exploited a flaw in Windows that Microsoft had announced a patch for less than 3 weeks earlier. The flaw was in a piece of the operating system that handled certain kinds of network connections. If a Windows machine wasn't yet patched, and many millions of them weren't, Sasser could land on it without anyone needing to do anything. Within days, Sasser had infected somewhere around 18 million computers worldwide. It crashed the computer it was on, then crashed it again every few minutes, making the machine essentially unusable. Delta Airlines had to cancel flights when its check-in computers went down. The British Coast Guard had to switch to paper records. The European Commission's offices in Brussels had to shut down their internal network for a day. Microsoft, by this point, was tired of teenagers writing worms that exploited its software. The company announced a bounty. Anyone who provided information leading to the arrest of Sasser's author would receive $250,000. The bounty was paid out within a week. The person who claimed it was a friend of Sven Yashan, an acquaintance from school, who had known what Sven was doing and had told the German authorities in exchange for the money. Yashan was arrested at his parents' house in Waffensen. He confessed. Because he had been under 18 when he wrote the worm, he was tried in juvenile court. The court sentenced him to 21 months of probation and 30 hours of community service. He was hired, almost immediately, by a German computer security company, who recognized that whatever else he was a teenager with a real talent for finding flaws in Microsoft software. And he had now learned, in a very direct way, what happened if he used that talent in the wrong direction. There was one more worm worth mentioning before the worm era ended, and it was the strangest one of all. It appeared in November of 2008, and it spread through a flaw in Windows that had been patched a few weeks before the worm appeared. The worm was called Configure, and within a few months it had infected somewhere between 9 and 15 million computers around the world, including, at one point, computers belonging to the French Navy, the German Army, the British Royal Air Force, and the British House of Commons. What was strange about Configure was that, after infecting all those machines, it seemed to do nothing. It just sat there. Every day, the millions of infected computers around the world would wake up and check a long list of websites for new instructions. Most days the websites didn't exist. Occasionally, the worm would update itself to a slightly more sophisticated version. But it never, in all the years it remained active, did anything that obviously took advantage of the enormous network of compromised machines it had built. A group of security researchers from companies like Microsoft and Symantec, along with academics from a few universities, formed what they called the Configure Working Group. They spent years trying to find whoever had written it. They worked with police agencies in dozens of countries. They followed the small digital trails the worm had left. They pre-registered the websites the worm would try to contact in advance to prevent its author from giving it new instructions. They were, by most measures, the largest coordinated investigation in the history of computer security up to that point. They never found the author. They never figured out with full certainty what the worm had been for. Some of them came to suspect, after years of work, that whoever had written Configure had not actually planned what to do with it. The worm was, possibly, an experiment that had grown so large so quickly that its creator became frightened of using it and simply walked away, leaving 15 million computers waiting for instructions that would never come. The worm era, for the most part, ended around 2009 or 2010. The reason it ended is not because young men stopped writing worms. The reason it ended is that Microsoft, after a decade of being blamed for the easiness of writing worms against its software, finally made it considerably harder to do so. Patches began to be installed automatically. The operating system began to defend itself in ways it hadn't before. The exposed surface that a worm needed to find, the unpatched, unprotected network-facing flaw, became rare. What replaced the worms wasn't safety. What replaced them was something stranger. The interesting work of breaking into computers shifted, in the late 2000s, from people working alone in bedrooms to groups working in offices. Some of those offices belonged to criminals. Some of them belonged to governments. And one of those government projects, when it was finally uncovered, would change the way the world thought about what a computer virus could be. Chapter 8: A Weapon Disguised as Code. In the summer of 2010, a small computer security firm in Belarus called Virus Blokada received a query from a client in Iran. The client's computers, the report said, were behaving strangely. They were rebooting on their own. They had become unstable in ways that didn't seem to be the result of any normal kind of problem. Could the firm in Belarus take a look? The Belarusian engineers, working through a sample of the strange code they had received, realized over the course of a few days that they were looking at something they had never seen before. The code was enormous by the standards of computer viruses. Most viruses were a few hundred kilobytes, small enough to pass through email without anyone noticing. This thing was almost half a megabyte. It had several different mechanisms for spreading itself, each one independent of the others. It used 4 different unpatched flaws in Windows to get into machines. 4 flaws nobody else in the world had known about. Each of those 4 flaws was the kind of thing that if you discovered it and sold it on the right market, would have been worth more than $100,000 by itself. And here was one piece of code using all 4 at once, casually, like someone with a fortune burning a hole in their pocket. The Belarusian firm wrote up what they had found and shared the sample with other security researchers around the world. By August, teams at Kaspersky Lab in Russia, at Symantec in California, and at a few other firms were trading findings and slowly piecing together what the program did. What the program did, it turned out, was almost unbelievable. It would land on a Windows computer. It would, very quietly, look around to see whether the computer was connected, directly or through a network, to a particular kind of industrial control system. Industrial control systems are the small, specialized computers that run factories, power plants, oil refineries, and other large pieces of physical infrastructure. They aren't normal personal computers. They're small, embedded machines, hidden inside cabinets, that handle the actual job of opening valves and turning motors and reading temperatures. They are almost never connected to the internet directly, which had historically given them a kind of safety. Nothing on the internet could reach them. This program reached them. It would copy itself onto USB drives, the small portable storage sticks that engineers carried around in their pockets, and then, the next time the USB drive was plugged into a computer that was connected to an industrial control system, it would jump over. From there, it would jump again, onto the industrial controllers themselves. And then, on the controllers, it would do something almost no virus had ever done before. It would look at what the controllers were controlling. Specifically, it was looking for centrifuges. More specifically, it was looking for a particular brand and model of centrifuge, a Siemens model used almost exclusively in uranium enrichment plants. Even more specifically, it was looking for centrifuges that were grouped in arrays of 164, which was the exact configuration used at a single facility in the world. That facility was an underground complex outside the city of Natanz in the central Iranian desert, where the government of Iran was enriching uranium as part of its nuclear program. If the program found that configuration, and apparently it did find it, it would settle in. It would record a few hours of normal centrifuge operation. Then, periodically, it would begin to spin the centrifuges either too fast or too slow, just outside the range they were built to tolerate, while simultaneously playing back the recording of normal operation to the monitoring systems, so that the human engineers watching the screens saw what looked like a perfectly running facility, while the centrifuges below them were tearing themselves apart. This had been going on, by the time the program was identified, for more than a year. Iranian officials had spent that year replacing centrifuges as they broke, unable to understand why they kept breaking, unable to find anything wrong on their monitoring screens. Their best engineers had been baffled. They had been losing capacity in their nuclear program at a rate that was significant but mysterious. They had not, until the news from Belarus arrived, had any idea what was happening to them. The program came to be called Stuxnet. Nobody is quite sure where the name came from. It was assembled by security researchers from a couple of strings of text they found in the code. But the name stuck, and Stuxnet is what the world has called it ever since. The question of who had written Stuxnet was not at first easy to answer. The program was too sophisticated to be the work of a single person, or even a small group. It contained knowledge of obscure Windows flaws, of Siemens industrial controllers, of centrifuge physics, of Natanz's specific facility configuration. It would have required, by most estimates, a team of dozens of highly specialized programmers working for at least a year, with access to intelligence about an Iranian nuclear facility that almost no civilian organization could have obtained. Over the next 2 years, through a slow accumulation of leaks and journalism, the answer came out. Stuxnet had been a joint project of the American and Israeli intelligence services, conducted under a code name that was eventually revealed to be Olympic Games. It had been authorized by President George W. Bush, expanded under President Barack Obama, and built, in some cases, on real centrifuges that the Americans had purchased and assembled in a Department of Energy laboratory in Tennessee for the purpose of testing the attack. The goal had been to slow Iran's nuclear program without the open military strike that the Israeli government had been considering. By most estimates, Stuxnet did set the program back, by perhaps a year or two. What Stuxnet meant, for the history of computer viruses, was that they had crossed a line, the same kind of line that had been crossed when someone first used an airplane to drop a bomb, or when someone first used a satellite to spy. The boundary between civilian and military had moved. Code, after Stuxnet, was a thing that governments built deliberately to break each other's physical infrastructure. It was an act of war that left no fingerprints, that crossed no borders that you could see on a map, and that could be denied indefinitely because it didn't look like anything except a small piece of software acting strangely on a computer in a desert. After Stuxnet, the people who wrote viruses changed again. Some were still teenagers in bedrooms. Some were criminals after money. But more and more, the largest and strangest and most expensive ones were the work of national intelligence agencies, building tools they hoped to never be caught using against targets they hoped never to acknowledge. One of those tools, built by the United States National Security Agency to break into Windows computers, would, in 2017, escape the agency. What happened? Next was the strangest single Friday in the modern history of computer viruses. Chapter 9. A Friday in May. The Friday morning in question was May 12, 2017. In a small Devon town on the southwestern coast of England, a 22-year-old named Marcus Hutchins was at home. He had taken the week off from work to relax. He lived with his parents. He worked, when he was working, as a malware analyst for a small security company, the kind of person whose job was to take apart computer viruses and figure out what they did. Hutchins had grown up obsessively interested in computers. He had also, in his teenage years, had a brief period when he had written some questionable code of his own. He had built a piece of banking fraud software when he was 15 or 16 and sold it to people online. He had never been caught for it. He had grown up, gone straight, and become, in his early 20s, one of the more talented young malware analysts in Britain. That Friday afternoon, around 2 o'clock his time, the Internet started to come apart in a particular way. Hospitals in the United Kingdom began noticing that their computers were no longer working. The screens were locked. A message had appeared, in red text on a black background, demanding $300 in Bitcoin in exchange for unlocking the files. If the payment wasn't made within 3 days, the price would double. If it wasn't made within a week, the files would be destroyed. The hospitals couldn't access patient records. They couldn't book surgeries. They couldn't see who had what allergy. The National Health Service, by mid-afternoon, was in something close to a panic. Hospitals across England and Scotland were affected. Ambulances were being diverted. Some patients were being turned away. The same scene was unfolding in dozens of other countries at the same time. Spain's largest phone company was hit. The German railway system was hit. Russian banks. The Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs. Companies in 70 or 80 countries, mostly running older versions of Windows, all started turning red at roughly the same time. The thing causing this was called WannaCry. It used, to spread itself, a particular exploit called Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue was a tool that the United States National Security Agency had built over years to take advantage of a flaw in older versions of Windows. The NSA had used it for its own intelligence purposes and had kept it secret. But in April of 2017, about a month before the Friday in question, a mysterious group calling itself the Shadow Brokers had released a large collection of NSA tools onto the public internet. Eternal Blue was one of them. Microsoft, having been warned by the NSA shortly before the leak, had released a patch for the flaw in March. Most computers had not yet been patched. Whoever wrote WannaCry, and the eventual attribution would point at a group of state-sponsored hackers working for North Korea, had taken Eternal Blue and built a piece of ransomware around it. Ransomware was, by 2010, an established category of computer virus. It would encrypt all the files on the machine it landed on, and then demand payment to undo the encryption. What made WannaCry different was that it could spread on its own, using Eternal Blue, without anyone needing to click anything. It was a worm and a ransomware combined. Once it reached one machine on a network, it would jump to all the other vulnerable machines on the same network within minutes. Marcus Hutchins, in his bedroom in Devon, was looking at a sample of WannaCry that a friend had sent him. He was trying to understand how it worked. He noticed something strange about the code. Before doing any of its malicious work, the program made a request to a specific website address, a long string of nonsense letters that looked like it had been typed by a cat walking across a keyboard. If the website responded, the program would stop. If the website didn't respond, the program would proceed. Hutchins checked whether the website existed. It did not. Nobody had registered the domain. For about $10.90, Hutchins registered it himself. He didn't quite know what he was doing. He was experimenting. The moment the website went live, WannaCry stopped spreading. Every new copy of the worm on every new machine checked the website, found it responding, and quietly shut itself down. The kill switch, the small piece of code that Hutchins had stumbled into by accident, had been built into the worm by whoever wrote it, possibly as a safeguard, possibly for reasons no one will ever fully know. By registering the nonsense domain, Hutchins had, by accident, ended the largest ransomware attack in history about 6 hours after it started. For about a week, Marcus Hutchins was an international hero. The British press called him the accidental hero. He was interviewed by every major outlet in the world. He was praised by the British government. The Devon papers wrote stories about the local lad in the bedroom who had saved the National Health Service. He turned 23. He was a little overwhelmed by the attention. He gave most of the interview money to charity. 3 months later, Hutchins flew to Las Vegas to attend a computer security conference called DEF-CON. It's the largest such conference in the world. He spent a week there, gave a talk, met people he had only known online, and got drunk at parties with the other young malware analysts. On August 3rd, 2010, at the airport on the way home, he was arrested by agents of the FBI. The charges had nothing to do with WannaCry. They had to do with the banking fraud software he had written 7 years earlier, as a teenager. American prosecutors had been quietly building a case against him for some time. They had decided that DEF-CON was a convenient moment to arrest him, when he happened to be on American soil. Marcus Hutchins spent the next 2 years in a kind of legal limbo in the United States, unable to leave the country, fighting the charges. He eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts related to the banking software. The judge, taking into account everything he had done since, including stopping WannaCry, sentenced him to time served and a year of supervised release. He went home to Devon a few months later. The story of WannaCry doesn't have a tidy ending. The hospitals in the United Kingdom recovered, slowly, over the course of weeks. The National Health Service spent an enormous amount of money upgrading the older Windows machines that had let the worm spread. The attribution to North Korea, when it came, was based on a careful comparison of WannaCry's code with other code believed to have been written by the same North Korean hacking group, which the United States called Lazarus. Nobody from Lazarus has ever been arrested. They almost certainly never will be. A month after WannaCry, in late June of 2017, something stranger and more destructive happened. A piece of code that came to be known as NotPetya began spreading through computers in Ukraine. It looked, at first, like a piece of ransomware similar to WannaCry. The screens on infected machines turned red. They demanded payment in Bitcoin. The aesthetic was almost identical. There was a difference, and the difference was crucial. NotPetya could not actually be paid. The way the program was written, even if you sent the money the screen demanded, the program had no way to give you back your files. The encryption it performed was irreversible. The ransom note was a kind of cosmetic lie, drawn over what was actually a piece of destruction software, pretending to be a thief. NotPetya had started in Ukraine, through a piece of accounting software that nearly every business in the country used. From there it spread, through corporate networks, to the rest of the world. It crippled the Danish shipping giant Maersk so completely that the company had to rebuild its entire global computer system, which took 10 days and cost an enormous amount of money. It hit FedEx, which had to take its European division offline. It hit Merck, the American pharmaceutical company. It hit Mondelez, which makes chocolate. It hit dozens of other multinational companies whose only crime was that they happened to have a branch office in Ukraine that used the Ukrainian accounting software. The eventual attribution, after months of investigation, was that NotPetya had been written and released by a unit of Russian military intelligence. The target had been Ukraine, with which Russia had been at war for 3 years. The damage to the rest of the world had been collateral, the result of the program spreading further than its creators had expected. In the same way that nearly every virus story we've talked about tonight has involved a program spreading further than its creators expected. NotPetya is, by most estimates, the most expensive computer virus in history. It caused around $10 billion in damage worldwide. No member of the Russian unit responsible has been arrested. Like the North Koreans behind WannaCry, they almost certainly never will be. What WannaCry showed the world was something the people in the security industry had been quietly worrying about for years. The tools that intelligence services built, in secret, to keep their countries safe could escape them. And when those tools escaped, they could be used by people the intelligence services would never have wanted to give them to. The boundary between a defensive weapon and an offensive one, in code, turned out to be less solid than the people who built the weapons had hoped. It was, in a small way, the same lesson that the Farouk Alvi brothers had stumbled into in Lahore in 1986. The brain virus had crossed a boundary the brothers had not known was there, the boundary between the things on their floppy disks and the things on someone else's. WannaCry, in 2017, had crossed a much larger boundary in the same direction. The tools the NSA had built to look at other people's computers turned out to also be tools that anyone could use to do anything to anyone's computer, anywhere. That is, in a sense, where this long story comes to rest. Not at an ending, because the story doesn't have one, but at a kind of resting place, where the patterns that started in the early 70s have grown to a size that nobody quite anticipated, and where the small initial gestures, a friendly message in 1901, a poem on an Apple II in 1982, a phone number in a piece of medical software in 1986, have grown by stages into something the world will be living with for a long time. Closing if you've been listening from the beginning of this, and if you have, thank you, although if you haven't, that's also exactly as it was meant to be. You may have noticed that nearly every story in tonight's long telling has the same small shape at its center. There is, in nearly every one of them, a person in a room. Not a powerful person usually, not someone the world had heard of before that night. A teenager in Pittsburgh. 2 brothers in Lahore. A graduate student in upstate New York. A dropped-out student in Manila. A 17-year-old in northern Germany. A young man in Devon who lived with his parents. There are exceptions. Stuxnet was the work of dozens of people in government offices in 2 countries. WannaCry was, in the end, the work of a state-sponsored group whose names will probably never be known. Even those stories begin, somewhere far upstream, with the small initial gestures of people who were not yet government employees, who were sitting alone in rooms, trying to figure out what a computer could be made to do. Almost none of those people, when you look at their lives carefully, were trying to do harm. Some of them were trying to make a joke. Some were trying to test a thesis. Some were trying to win a small argument with a software company that they felt was being careless. Some were trying to count the size of the internet. A few were trying to make a political point that no one ever quite understood. The harm came when it came, not because they intended it, but because the world they were experimenting in turned out to be larger and more delicate than they had pictured. That is, in some way, the deepest thing the story of computer viruses has to say. It is a story about the strange new property of code, which is that you can write something small in your own room in an afternoon, and it can go anywhere. It can reach the other side of the world by tomorrow morning. It can land on the machine of a person you will never meet, in a country you have never visited, who is using it for something you cannot imagine. The room you are writing in is not a closed room. It opens, through the network, into all the other rooms. People throughout the history we've just walked through have been learning that, in different ways, at different speeds. Rich Skrenta learned it when someone in the United States Navy encountered elk cloner. The Farouk Alvi brothers learned it when a stranger from Iowa called them on the phone. Robert Morris Jr. learned it on the early hours of November 3, 1988, when he understood, all at once, that his graduate school measurement experiment had taken down 10% of the Internet. Onel de Guzman learned it on the morning of May 5, 2000, when he turned on his television and saw his own 3 words being read by anchors on the international news. Each of them learned, in their own way, that the boundary between their room and the world was thinner than it had felt when they sat down to type. If there is something to take away from any of this, although there isn't really, and you don't need to, it might be only this. Every program that runs anywhere in the world was, at some point, a small thing that someone wrote in a room. Every email you have ever sent, every photograph your phone has ever organized for you, every video that has ever streamed to a screen in your house, every banking transaction that has ever cleared. They all began as small pieces of code, on a screen, in a room, in front of a person. Most of those people were trying to do something useful. A small number of them were trying to do something destructive, or curious, or strange. The strange ones are the ones we've spent the last few hours with. They are not most of the story of computers. They are a minority report. They are the part of the story that taught everyone else, gradually, what the rest of the story was going to require. The work of defending against the kinds of programs we've talked about tonight has, over the decades, become a quiet industry of its own. thousands of people in offices around the world sit in front of screens and analyze new viruses as they appear. They write the updates that your phone downloads in the background while you sleep. They build the patches that close the small holes through which the next strange thing might otherwise have come. Most of them you have never heard of. Most of them you will never hear of. They are the descendants, in a way, of Ray Tomlinson at BBN in 1971, who wrote Reaper to chase Creeper around the network the day after Creeper showed up. They are quietly, patiently, mostly successfully, keeping the rooms of the world from being entered by things their occupants would not want. You don't need to remember any of this. You especially don't need to worry about any of this, because the worrying isn't useful, and because the people we mentioned a moment ago, the descendants of Ray Tomlinson, are taking care of the parts of it that need to be taken care of even right now, while you have been listening. Right now, somewhere in the world, in an office in Bangalore or in Reston, Virginia, or in a quiet building in Helsinki, a person you will never meet is staring at a screen and taking apart something new that has appeared in the last few hours. They are doing it carefully, the way Ray Tomlinson did it carefully in 1971. They are writing notes to themselves. They are figuring out where it came from, and what it does and how to stop it from spreading further. By morning, the patches will have moved through the network. Your phone will have downloaded them while it sat on your bedside table. You won't have noticed. That's how it's meant to work. The defenses get quieter as they get better, until eventually you forget that they are there at all. What might be worth carrying away, if you carry anything at all, is only this. The story of computer viruses is one of the most surprising small histories of the last 50 years. It starts with a friendly little message on a research network in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It moves through a poem on an Apple II and a phone number in a piece of Pakistani medical software. It passes through a graduate student in upstate New York and a heartbroken dropout in Manila. It widens in the new century into the unfamiliar shape of code as a tool of governments. And it ends, more or less, with a young man in Devon, alone in a bedroom, who saved a great many strangers by accident on a Friday afternoon, and then was arrested for something he had done as a teenager, and then was eventually allowed to go home. That is, more or less, where we leave it tonight. There will be more chapters, of course. There always are. New small things will be written by new people in new rooms, and some of them will travel further than the people who wrote them expected. The network is not a closed network. It never was. It never will be. That, for tonight, is enough. The room you are in is quiet. The lights, if you left them on, can stay on or turn off. The blanket, if you pulled it up, is still where you left it. The story will still be here in the morning. Nothing depended on you holding on to any of it. Sleep well.